Thanks for coming to Buffalo Street Books. We do events every week. We do almost one event a week. Sometimes we do 4 or 5 events a week. This is our last event in September, because this is the last day of September. We're just working out our October schedule now. You can find it on our website. I think we have something like 16 events. I'd rattle them off, but you didn't come here to hear me. You came here to hear David. We're thrilled to have him. He's going to be discussing his book, The Road Not Taken, that... there's a longer title. Yeah, thank you. Finding America in the poem Everyone Loves and Almost Everyone Gets Wrong. We also have copies of The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, which David has done an introduction for, New Penguin Classic. We have copies of both on our counter if you'd like to purchase one or both, several copies. We're not going to stop you. So copies are up there, but enough from me. Please welcome David.
Yeah, it's always good to have a ringer in the crowd. What I'd like to do is just read a little bit from the introduction to this book, which should give you some sense of what it's all about, and hopefully not for too long, maybe 20 minutes or so, and then just describe the structure of the book, and then take questions, because I have found that this is a subject that people like to ask questions about. Of course, now I say that, no one's going to actually ask any questions, but we'll see. So the book is called The Road Not Taken, Finding America in the Poem Everyone Loves and Almost Everyone Gets Wrong. I was trying to set the record for the longest subtitle. Pretty close, I think. So this is how it starts. A young man hiking through a forest is abruptly confronted with a fork in the path. He pauses, his hands in his pockets, and looks back and forth between his options. As he hesitates, images from possible futures flicker past. The young man wading into the ocean, hitchhiking, riding a bus, kissing a beautiful woman, working, laughing, eating, running, weeping. The series resolves at last into a view of a different young man with his thumb out on the side of a road. As a car slows to pick him up, we realize the driver is the original man from the crossroads, only now he's accompanied by a lovely woman and a child. The man smiles slightly, as if confident in the life he's chosen and happy to lend that confidence to a fellow traveler. As the car pulls away and the screen is lit with gold, for it's a commercial we've been watching, the emblem of the Ford Motor Company briefly appears. You can't pay for this. You don't have to listen to all of it, baby. The advertisement I've just described ran in New Zealand in 2008, and it is, in most respects, a normal piece of smartly assembled and quietly manipulative product promotion. But there is one very unusual aspect to this commercial. Here is what is read by a voiceover artist in the distinctive vowels of New Zealand as the young man ponders his choice. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. It is, of course, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. In the commercial, this fact is never announced. The audience is expected to recognize the poem unaided. For any mass audience to recognize any poem is, to put it mildly, unusual. For an audience of car buyers in New Zealand to recognize a 100-year-old poem from a country 8,000 miles away is something else entirely. But this isn't just any poem, it's The Road Not Taken, and it plays a unique role not simply in American literature, but in American culture, and in world culture as well. Its signature phrases have become so ubiquitous, so much a part of everything from coffee mugs to refrigerator magnets to graduation speeches, that it's almost possible to forget the poem is actually a poem. In addition to the Ford commercial, the road not taken has been used in advertisements for Mentos, which is true, Nicorette, the multi-billion-dollar insurance company AIG, and the job search website Monster.com, which deployed the poem, during Super Bowl 34 to great success. Its lines have been borrowed by musical performers, including, among many others, Bruce Hornsby, Melissa Etheridge, and George Strait, and it's provided episode titles for more than a dozen television series, including Taxi, The Twilight Zone, and Battlestar Galactica, as well as lending its name to at least one video game, Spry Fox's Road Not Taken, quote, a roguelike puzzle game about surviving life's surprises. As one might expect, the influence of the Road Not Taken is even greater on journalists and authors. Over the past 35 years alone, language from Frost's poem has appeared in nearly 2,000 news stories worldwide, which yields a rate of more than once a week. In addition, The Road Not Taken appears as a title, subtitle, or chapter heading in more than 400 books by authors other than Robert Frost, on subjects ranging from political theory to the impending zombie apocalypse. True. At least one of these was a massive international bestseller, M. Scott Peck's self-help book, The Road Less Traveled, A New Psychology of Love, Traditional Values, and Spiritual Growth, which was originally published in 1978 and has sold more than 7 million copies in the United States and Canada. Given the pervasiveness of Frost's lines, it should come as no surprise that the popularity of The Road Not Taken appears to exceed that of every other major 20th century American poem, including those often considered more central to the modern era. Admittedly, the popularity of poetry is difficult to judge. Poems that are attractive to educators may not be popular with readers, so the appearance of a given poem in anthologies and on syllabi doesn't necessarily reveal much. And book sales indicate more about the popularity of a particular poet than of any individual poem. But there are at least two reasons to think that The Road Not Taken is the most widely read and recalled American poem of the past century. The first is the Favorite Poem Project, which was devised by former poet laureate Robert Penske. Penske used his public role to ask Americans to submit their favorite poem in various forms. The clear favorite among more than 18,000 entries was The Road Not Taken. The second, more persuasive reason comes from Google, as so many reasons tend to do these days. Until it was discontinued in late 2012, a tool called Google Insights for Search allowed anyone to see how frequently certain expressions were being searched by users worldwide over time, and to compare expressions to one another. And then I go into some description of how this works, which, since you don't have the book in front of you, it's going to be kind of hard to see, but there's a bunch of charts. Two short charts. But basically the point here is to show that if you take Google search data, you can see that people search for Road Not Taken and Frost at a rate something like 4 times the rate that they search for Eliot and The Wasteland, or Eliot and Prufrock. And I then actually expand it to put the poem against some other fairly well-known cultural objects. And it's searched at a rate that more than doubles the rate people search for Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan, and something like 3 times the rate that people search for The Great Gatsby. So anyway, now to return to the text. The results here are even more impressive when you consider that The Road Not Taken is routinely misidentified as The Road Less Traveled, thereby reducing the search volume under the poem's actual title. Frost once claimed his goal as a poet was, quote, to lodge a few poems where they will be hard to get rid of. With The Road Not Taken, he appears to have lodged his lines in granite. On a word-for-word basis, it may be the most popular piece of literature ever written by an American. And almost everyone gets it wrong. This is the most remarkable thing about The Road Not Taken, not its immense popularity, which is remarkable enough, but the fact that it is popular for what seem to be the wrong reasons. It's worth pausing here to underscore a truth so obvious that it is often taken for granted. Most widely celebrated artistic projects are known for being essentially what they purport to be. When we play White Christmas in December, we correctly assume it's a song about memory and longing centered around the image of snow falling at Christmas. When we read Joyce's Ulysses, we correctly assume that it's a complex story about a journey around Dublin as filtered through many voices and styles. A cultural offering may be simple or complex, cooked or raw, but its audience nearly always knows what kind of dish is being served. Frost's poem turns this expectation on its head. Most readers consider The Road Not Taken to be a salute to triumphant self-assertion. I took the one less traveled by. But the literal meaning of the poem's own lines seems completely at odds with this interpretation. The poem's speaker tells us he, quote, shall be telling, at some point in the future, of how he took the road less traveled by, Yet he has already admitted that the two paths, quote, equally lay in leaves, and, quote, the passing there had warned them really about the same. So the road he will later call less traveled is actually the road equally traveled. The two roads are interchangeable. According to this reading, then, the speaker will be claiming ages and ages hence that his decision made all the difference, only because this is the kind of claim we make when we want to comfort or blame ourselves by assuming that our current position is the product of our own choices, as opposed to what was chosen for us or allotted to us by chance. The poem isn't a salute to can-do individualism, it's a commentary on the self-deception we practice when constructing the story of our own lives. The road not taken may be, as the critic Franklin Tricchia memorably put it, the best example in all of American poetry of a wolf in sheep's clothing. But we could go further. It may be the best example in all of American culture of a wolf in sheep's clothing. In this, it strongly resembles its creator. Frost is the only major literary figure in American history with two distinct audiences, one of which regularly assumes that the other has been deceived. The first audience is relatively small and consists of poetry devotees, most of whom inhabit the art form's academic subculture. For these readers, Frost is a mainstay of syllabi and seminars and a regular subject of scholarly articles, though he falls well short of inspiring the interest that Ezra Pound and Wallace Stevens enjoy. He's considered bleak, dark, complex, and manipulative, a genuine poet's poet, not a historical artifact like Longfellow or a folk balladeer like Carl Sandburg. While Frost isn't the most esteemed of the early 20th century poets, very few dedicated poetry readers talk about him as if he wrote greeting card verse. Then there is the other audience. This is the great mass of readers at all age levels who can conjure a few lines of The Road Not Taken and stopping by woods on a snowy evening and possibly mending wall or birches, and who think of Frost as quintessentially American in the way that amber waves of grain are quintessentially American. To these readers, or so the first audience often assumes, he isn't bleak or sardonic, but rather a symbol of Yankee stoicism and countrified wisdom. This audience is large. Indeed, the search patterns of Google users indicate that in terms of popularity, Frost's true peers aren't Pound or Stevens or Eliot, but rather figures like Pablo Picasso and Winston Churchill. Frost is not simply that rare bird, a popular poet. He's one of the best-known personages of the past 100 years in any cultural arena. In all of American history, the only writers who can match or surpass him are Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe, and the only poet in the history of English language verse who commands more attention is William Shakespeare. This level of recognition makes poetry readers uncomfortable. Poets, we assume, are not popular, at least after 1910 or so. If one becomes popular then, either he must be a second-tier talent catering to mass taste, or there must be some kind of confusion or deception going on. The latter explanation is generally applied to Frost's celebrity. As Robert Lowell once put it in his poem, Robert Frost at midnight, the audience gone to vapor, the great act laid on the shelf in mothballs. The, quote, great act is for the audience of ordinary readers, but his true admirers know better. He is really a wolf, we say, and it is only the sheep who are fooled. It's an explanation that Frost himself sometimes encouraged, much as he used to boast about the trickiness of The Road Not Taken in private correspondence. I'll bet not half a dozen people can tell you who was hit and where he was hit by my road not taken, he wrote to his friend Louis Untermeyer. In this sense, the poem is emblematic. Just as millions of people know its language about the road, quote, less traveled, without understanding what that language is actually saying, millions of people recognize its author without understanding what that author was actually doing. But is this view of The Road Not Taken and its creator entirely accurate? Poems, after all, aren't arguments. They are to be interpreted, not proven, and that process of interpretation admits a range of possibilities, some supported by diction, some by tone, some by quirks of form and structure. Certainly it's wrong to say that The Road Not Taken is a straightforward and sentimental celebration of individualism. This interpretation is contradicted by the poem's own lines. Yet it's also not quite right to say that the poem is merely a knowing literary joke disguised as shop-worn magazine verse that has somehow managed to fool millions of readers for 100 years. A role too artfully assumed ceases to become a role and instead becomes a species of identity, an observation equally true of Robert Frost himself. One of Frost's greatest advocates, the scholar Richard Poirier, has written with regard to Frost's recognition among ordinary readers that, quote, there is no point trying to explain the popularity away, as if it were a misconception prompted by a pose. By the same token, there is no point in trying to explain away the general misreadings of the road not taken as if they were a mistake encouraged by a fraud. The poem both is and isn't about individualism, and it both is and isn't about rationalization. It isn't a wolf in sheep's clothing so much as a wolf that is somehow also a sheep, or a sheep that is also a wolf. It is a poem about the necessity of choosing that somehow, like its author, never makes a choice itself, that instead repeatedly returns us to the same enigmatic, leaf-shadowed crossroads. So I think I'm going to stop there, so we'll have a little bit of time as I see what time I'm at here. Okay. So the introduction goes on to talk a little bit about the way in which the poem is distinctly American and its emphasis on choice and in the kind of drama that it gives us of choosing. And then I point out that this is a little bit ironic because the poem was supposedly inspired by an Englishman. Does anybody know the story of the origin of The Road Not Taken? Frost has a very unusual career. Actually, that's underselling it. Frost has a completely crazy career. It makes absolutely no sense. He published his first book at age 40, and he had almost no success the entire first half of his career in the United States, and decided, again in his very late 30s, that the way to fix this situation would be to move to England. Just, yeah. And unbelievably, what can you say? Sure, things aren't working here, move to England. Right before World War II. World War I. And he does this, and it, against all odds or any sense, succeeds. He immediately becomes a sensation in the UK. And one of the reasons that he was so successful is that he met an English critic named Edward Thomas, who was also a poet, although he was keeping that under wraps at the time. And Thomas and Frost became very, very, very close friends. And Thomas is basically the only poet that Frost ever truly befriended without any sort of ambiguities or competitiveness clouding the situation. But he and Thomas both loved to take walks in the woods. And Thomas, as sort of the native guide, so to speak, would usually pick the path. And Thomas, unlike Frost, was a sort of romantic, hesitant, doubting sensibility in some ways. And according to Frost, at least, Thomas would always regret whatever path they took. Frost thought this was very funny because Frost was just the kind of guy who goes to England on a whim and does whatever he wants. You know, here's Thomas saying, oh, we should have gone back because there's a really great tree over there, you know. So Frost thought this was really amusing. And after Frost returned to the States, he wrote this poem, and he sent it to Thomas with no accompanying text, nothing at all, just the poem under the title Two Roads, expecting that Thomas would find this to be sort of a funny joke at his expense and they would sort of share a laugh. Well, Thomas, like every reader of this poem since then, doesn't get it at all and thinks Frost talking about himself, and he's like, are you regretting your choices, or what? Are you really congratulating yourself? I mean, they end up exchanging fully 6 letters until Thomas gets the poem fully, at which point Thomas says something like, you know, I think you're going to have some trouble with this poem down the line. But, as you were saying, what happens later is Matthew Hollis, who wrote a biography of Thomas that came out, was it last year? Okay. Yeah, the suggestion has always been that Thomas may have viewed the poem as a bit of a goad because Thomas was debating whether to enlist in the army to fight in World War I. And there's some possibility that he did sort of view it that way, or at least viewed the sort of decisive example of Robert Frost in that way. So he did enlist in the army, and he was killed. So it's kind of a tragic story, and of course Frost was brokenhearted about the whole thing. So yeah, it's an interesting backstory to this poem too. So I'm going to talk just for a second about the way the book is structured, and then maybe we could do questions. It's a fun poem to talk about. So the book is really in 4 parts. The first chapter is called The Poet, and I talk a lot about Frost, and I'm sort of introducing Frost's biography and some of the controversies of his biography, because unlike some other writers, he had a very interesting draw in his biographer, because his biographer came to despise him and wrote a very, very difficult book that has caused problems for Frost scholars for decades now. The next chapter is called The Poem, and it's essentially a close reading of the poem. It's a little more than that, or a little different from that in some ways, because one of the things I'm trying to do in that chapter is show choices that Frost deliberately didn't make in writing this poem. One of the reasons that the poem is so tricky and it doesn't resolve is that Frost refuses to make the poem be one thing or another. And there's sort of different offshoot variant versions of The Road Not Taken that I write to kind of show how he could have simplified the poem if he wanted to, but he deliberately didn't. And then the second half of the book is really about the way this poem figures in American identity and American culture. So there's a chapter called The Choice, which is about the American fascination with choice and the way this poem is emblematic of that fascination and also sort of critiques that fascination. And I talk a lot about a lot of things, neuroscience, and which I don't fully understand, but I think actually fits in fairly well. And a lot of the literature of choice that's come out of the social sciences, which seems to suggest that we don't have as much control of our choices as we think. And then the last chapter of the book is about the chooser, the part of us that we think makes choices, the self. And I talk a little bit about philosophy. And then there's an epilogue in which I talk about the crossroads, which for me is the most interesting part of the poem. And it's an interesting literary motif. It's occurred for 1,000 years now, people invoking the crossroads to kind of show people in between possibilities and in a space of incompleteness in some sense. So that's what the book is about. Would anybody like to ask questions about the book, about Robert Frost?
So when you say that the poem that almost everyone gets wrong, you're including the people who read it in the more, sort of ironic way.
I think so.
Who are getting it wrong.
Well, there's degrees of wrongness, as we all know. I think that reading isn't fully satisfactory either, because had Frost wanted to write that poem, this is actually something I go into a good bit in the chapter that's really focused on the language of the poem. I mean, Frost was a complicated character in many ways, but he's very funny and he's very smart, and he was certainly happy to write parodies of romantic attitudes. And that he wanted to do that, there are more straightforward ways for him to do it. I mean, I think that the way the poem throws in these little notes of strangeness kind of make both readings unsatisfactory. I mean, one of the most obvious things that's really odd about this poem is the title. It's called The Road Not Taken, right? Everybody thinks it's called The Road Less Traveled, The Road Not Taken. But what's the emphasis at the end? It's, I took the one less traveled by. So what road are we talking about in the title? Is it the road not taken by other people, or the road not taken by the speaker? Is he now regretting this road, even though he says he's going to claim to have taken the road less traveled? Or is it just talking about his position in the crossroads when no road has been taken yet? I mean, it's a very confusing title. And when you think it means one thing, you can kind of shift around and make it mean something else, which to me is just generally the case with this poem. It really fails to resolve in a way that, I mean, most poems that are good fail to resolve perfectly, but this one really just keeps spinning you around. Anybody else?
You mentioned that in writing the poem to his English friend, he titled it Two Roads.
Right.
So where did the title come from?
Well, that's one of the reasons I think the title's so interesting, because Two Roads is sort of a safer title for this poem. I mean, it doesn't really lend itself to quite as much confusion, although even there's a little confusion, just because some people think, we usually think of this poem as being, well, there's the road, and then it splits, right? But if it's two roads diverging, it could also be like this. So a real crossroads, like a four-way intersection. I don't find that totally satisfying, because I think that's just too confusing. But I have seen critics argue that, and they have a point. I mean, at every stage, Frost makes the poem harder to pin down. So yeah, I mean, the road not taken was a deliberate choice by Frost when he already had a title that worked perfectly well to just make the poem even more of a puzzle.
Did his friend in England help him, offer any criticism, any changes? Did anything happen to that poem between the time he first sent it?
It's a great question. Nothing really significant. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, which is the other big Chestnut Frost poem, there are a bunch of early drafts that you can sort of look at and say, okay, Frost did this, then he did this, or at least that's what I'm told. This poem, there's nothing early that you can look at and say, well, he was going to do this, then he did this, except for the title. There's some minor stuff with the dash at one point, but it's debatable whether that's really that important. But no, he didn't usually suggest too many changes to Frost. Frost didn't like it when people would suggest changes. He was a very prickly character. He used to make fun of Ezra Pound for always wanting to get together with other poets and edit each other's stuff. Frost wanted to go off in his room and edit his things on his own. He at one point locked himself in his own kitchen to finish a poem. He felt like he was procrastinating too much. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was curious about your rewriting of the poem.
Right.
So what was it like to do that? And is that controversial?
Right. One of the things I do in this book to kind of clarify some of the parts of the poem that are so muddied is to show ways that he could have written the poem to just make it more straightforward. I'm not claiming these are good poems. In fact, they're often kind of bad. But hopefully the badness sort of demonstrates how good Frost was at writing this particular poem. No, I mean, I haven't heard any pushback on that. People do it
Or
occasionally.
that's
Not
a thing critics do? Or?
sometimes, not very. I think not to the degree that I do it here usually, but people will occasionally do things like that. Just to show, for instance, if you want to show how a particular meter is working, you might try to recast it in another meter. It can be tricky to do. Actually, does anybody want to hear one of the rewritten? Okay, yeah, since we just sat here and talked about it. You see, okay, so if you wanted to write the sort of, hymn to Stoic individualism, the poem might go something like this. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. To where they ended, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and posing perhaps the greater test, because it was narrow and wanted wear, rising so steeply into thinning air that a man would struggle just to rest. While the other offered room to play or stand at ease along the track, I took the lonelier road that day, and knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one that dared me to try, and that has made all the difference. All right, so conversely, though, if you think of the poem as being just this sort of skewering of romantic dithering, you might rewrite the poem this way. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. To where they ended, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and making perhaps the better case, because it seemed to lead elsewhere, though at day's end each traveller there would finish in the self-same place. For both, I learned, were arms that lay around the wood and met in one track, and whichever one I took that day would lead itself to the other way, and send me forward to take me back. Still, I shall be claiming with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one on the left-hand side, and that has made all the difference. That's a parody. That's a parody of romantic dithering. Now, I mean, again, I'm not saying it's good, but that's if you wanted to just write the poem where you say, oh, you think your choices matter, but they don't matter, that's how you could do it. But that's not what Frost does. He does all these completely oddball things, like say things like, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler. I mean, what a completely bizarre thing to say. I mean, of course you can't be one traveler. What are you talking about? And then the more you think about what he's saying, the more interesting it seems. Because there's this sort of implicit suggestion that any choice you make changes you. I mean, that's one of the many things you can get out of just those few words, Sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. The suggestion is that even if he came back to the crossroads and took the other road, he wouldn't be one traveler, he'd be a different traveler at that point. So anyway, the book covers a lot of this. Anybody else questions? Sure.
The idea that you could get this wrong, right? You know the famous image of the duck rabbit?
Right.
I mean, you look at this poem and it's a duck.
Right.
And then you look at it and it's a rabbit. But you can't get the duck rabbit wrong. It just is a duck rabbit.
Well,
People get this wrong.
well,
It can't be.
Well, I mean, right, it's the duck and the rabbit at the same time. So, I mean, maybe it's the poem. I've actually thought the other possible subtitle for this book could be Finding America in the poem, Everyone Gets Just a Little Bit Right. Might be a better way to put it. I'm really glad that you mentioned the duck rabbit, because that is actually the exact same thing that I use in the book. It's called a thaumatrope, those rotating toys. And I think obviously I think that since I thought so too. Like, aren't we smart? It's a thaumatrope. It's used in a famous judicial decision. Let me see if I can read you the section about that, since you brought that up. So anyway, it comes from the image, the use of that in this kind of context comes from a book called The Elements of Logic. So I'll just read you from the book. Anyway, if you think of the poem not as stating various viewpoints, but rather as performing them, setting them beside and against one another, then a very different reading emerges. Here it's helpful, as is so often the case, to call upon a 19th century logician. In The Elements of Logic, Richard Whately describes the fallacy of substitution like so. Two distinct objects may, by being dexterously presented again and again in quick succession, to the mind of a cursory reader, be so associated together in his thoughts as to be conceived capable of being actually combined in practice. The fallacious belief thus induced bears a striking resemblance to the optical illusion effected by that ingenious and philosophical toy called the thaumatrope, in which two objects painted on opposite sides of a card, for instance a man and a horse, a bird in a cage, are, by a quick rotatory motion, made to impress the eye in combination, so as to form one picture of the man on the horse's back, the bird in the cage, etc. Then I say, what is fallacious in an argument can be mesmerizing in a poem. The road not taken acts as a kind of thaumatrope, rotating its two opposed divisions so that they seem at times to merge, and that merging is produced not by a careful blending of the two, a union, but by, quote, rapid and frequent transitions, as Whately put it. The title itself is a small but potent engine that drives us first toward one untaken road and then immediately back to the other, producing a vision in which we appear somehow on both roads or neither. So, yeah, thank you for that.
I just mentioned a bit about the technique of rewriting the poem.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Do you know there's a book by W.D. Snodgrass in which he does that with a whole bunch of poems as a sort of exercise.
Oh, really?
Why the poems are perfect, and he rewrites them so that basically ruins each poem.
Excellent. I know it's nothing more fun than ruining a good poem. No, I didn't actually know that Snodgrass. I know it's.
The name of the book.
Oh, cool, great. Great, I'll have to look at it. That's terrific. Yeah, I know Helen Bindler does it in her Yeats book, although I had some difficulties the way she did it. But yeah, it's like it's a tactic that people use.
If the poem is in part, as I have read one interpretation to be, that he's kind of making fun of his friend for dithering, and he's kind of saying it doesn't really matter what you do, just make a decision. But he's giving you another message at the same time, which is that he took, he's very superior at the end in taking this creative approach to life. And even if he denies that this is the case, everyone is going to see that he on some level is talking about making a decision to lead a creative life or to do something different and follow your own, what's now become a cliche, bliss,
Right.
follow your own path. But so he, it's almost as though, unless he's being extremely sarcastic at the end, like really ridiculously biting, then he's kind of pulling the poem together in a way that contradicts all of the potential for making fun of the dithering.
Sure. I could, yeah, I think so. I do think that's a way to look at the poem, because for one thing that's really unsatisfying about looking at this poem is just this skewering of his friend's dithering, is that Edward Thomas really was his friend.
Right.
I think there's a critic, Catherine Kearns, who's written about this, and she is, I agree with her. One of the things that she says is that, people tend to forget that the poem is, whether it was really about Thomas or not, who knows? Frost told all acres of lies about his poems. Most poets do. You have to. What else are you going to do? But, you don't know why you write things. You just write things. But it's at least certainly the case, or probably the case, that the poem was pretty strongly associated in Frost's mind with Thomas. And if he's truly fond of Thomas, as everybody seems to agree that he was, and believe me, Frost's biographer, if he could have found anything that proved that Frost was unkind to Thomas, he would have written pages and pages about it. Nobody's found that. Everyone agrees Frost liked Thomas. So it seems as if reading the poem as if it's just sort of skewering isn't fully satisfying.
Well, not
right?
skewering, but kind of making
Right.
sort of being playful, because it's because the poem, there's a lot of ambiguity. There's
Right.
so much beautiful, pensive, considering the paths that it isn't just totally a skewering type of thing.
Right. I agree with you. I don't think that it is. I don't think that's the most interesting way to read it anyway. And you always want to read poems for sort of maximum interestingness. It's like the only rule of poetry. Thank you so much. It's incredibly nice of you guys to show up. I was expecting like 3 people. So. Very nice. Thanks a lot.